you were born in England, but from Welsh parents, and so what gave you the impetus to break out of Wales?
I never really thought about Wales in those terms. I mean, my home was Cardiff. Mm-hmm. My family was all English speaking. I went to school originally, nursery school and primary school in Cardiff, De La Salle, and then we moved to Scotland at the outbreak of the war, because my dad was in the army, and he was stationed in what were then called the Guards Pioneers, which was really almost like the forerunner of the SAS, the commando brigades. And so they went up to Scotland, where they were training to be on the first of the raids. The first of the commando raids were in Norway, and so he was on those sort of things. And so from the beginning of the war, from then onwards, I was never back in Wales, although we always had the family home was always there. So one came back, but other members of the family lived in the family home, which was in Roath, Newminster Road in Cardiff. I'm very dyslexic, and at the time when I was at school, there was no such word even. You were thick, basically. Yes, yes. I was really very good at sports, and that kind of got me through school okay. You know, I was in the sports team, therefore he must be a goodie, you know. But the problem is that when I came to leave school, I had no qualifications whatsoever, because all examinations at that time were written based. So even if you wanted to be, as I wanted to be, a vet or an archaeologist, a vet, you know, I was very good at cutting up worms and frogs and those sort of things that you did at that time, and I liked all that. But then when it came to the examination, the main thing you had to do was to write an essay about this, which of course I couldn't do. So I had no qualifications, therefore I couldn't go to university. And even if I was to go to university to do veterinary at that time, you had to have Latin as one of your major subjects. I mean, I sometimes say to young students nowadays, you're grumbling, you know, how many of you would do Latin as one of your subjects to get into university? So what I did was that I left school and went into the army. You had to do national service at that time. And so I thought, well, I'll go straight in there. And for various reasons, mainly to do with the fact that I was very good at sports, I found myself, first of all, at Eton Hall, which is the officers' training for national service. And then I was called down to Sandhurst, I think primarily because the head of Sandhurst was an English rugby international, and he was trying to get the best team in the country at that time. Yeah. So I arrived there to play rugby with, you know, like 3 South African internationals were there and a New Zealand guy and all this sort of thing.
Could I ask you what position you played?
Well, it really depended on who was playing. See, I'm trying to think of his name. Sharp. Was it Sharp? The English outside half was there at that time. And so if he played, I played in the centre. If he was injured, which he was quite frequently, I would play it outside half. So it depended. I was always sort of running second to somebody else. Yeah. But anyway, it was great fun. And so I thought, you know, my life was mapped out for me. You know, I would retire whatever time you do in the army, and by that time I would probably be a lieutenant colonel. You just automatically went through if you'd been to Sandhurst. And whilst I was fit, I was being a professional sports person. So it was very enjoyable. I loved the army. And the army was very, in hindsight, was really very good for me, because one of the things you do at Sandhurst is to learn to be very precise about breaking things down into their real component parts. Right. So if you are doing an attack on somewhere, you have to think, what is it? I've got to get there. Now, how do I get there? You can't be sidetracked. Yeah. You can't suddenly think, oh, I'll go over there because the trees are so beautiful. You suddenly say, well, the way to get there is this, this and this.
Yes. And
that, I found later in photography, was an invaluable lesson.
So creating strategies in order...
Yeah, strategies. And what is the essential component parts of what you're doing, so that you don't get sidetracked and bullshit into all sorts of pictures which have nothing to do with the actual end product that you're trying to do.
Yes.
But I'd never shot a picture of anything. I knew nothing about it. At Sandhurst, we were obviously indoctrinated, I suppose would be the word, that all Russians ate their children sort of thing. You know, they were terrible people and we were all perfect and this, that and the other. And I remember being in the officers' mess there at one time, and the magazines, you used to get the magazines, of which one of the main ones was Picture Post.
Yes.
And I picked up this issue of Picture Post, and I've still got the issue here, so I know the date of it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But there was a picture story which ran over, in fact, 4 editions of Picture Post, and it was about the people of Moscow. And I think it was probably the 2nd edition of it. I was opening it up, and suddenly I looked at this picture, and I started, in the officer's mess, to cry, and cried quite powerfully. And you don't do that in an officer's mess. You know, the idea of somebody crying.
Over a picture?
Over anything.
Yes, over anything.
Over anything.
Yes.
I mean, by God, we're all soldiers, you know. And what it was a picture of an army officer buying his wife a hat in a department store. The reason why I started to cry is that I hadn't seen my dad during the whole of the Second World War. And when he came back from at the end of the war, the first thing he did was take my mum, with me in tow, to Howells, and he bought her a hat. And so my first real memory of them in a loving condition was her buying a hat, etc. And as I say, it brought this all back to me, and I started to go, and I suddenly realised that photography had the power to make you cry.
Yes.
And I thought that was wonderful.
Yes.
So well. And not only that, but it had the power to make you cry about something which was really mundane.
Yes.
And I loved that link, and literally I said, this is what I really want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I went to the Philip Jones Griffiths exhibition in Aberystwyth, and the Vietnam stuff, of course, very powerful, but the ones that actually touched me and made me feel very emotional, actually made me cry, were the early pictures he took. And of children and things, and they were just so powerful and so emotive.
But he's interesting because, you see, he dismisses those pictures. He said they were the practice for him to get out into the world later. It's very strange. But by the way, that was a beautifully organised
and beautifully crafted, yes.
Wonderful exhibition.
Yes.
Wonderful exhibition.
Yes.
Sadly, it means that Philip, I suspect, will now be forgotten, because it's gone into an archive of which nobody's going to see.
Yes.
You know, it's the big problem with Aberystwyth. Yes. I mean, they're nice people and it's a lovely town and all that sort of stuff. But the answer is, who in the hell's going to come? You know, people arrive in London to see some big exhibition at the V&A or something. They are not going to get on the train to go to Aberystwyth.
No.
And so, by and large, nobody's going to look at it. And it's amazing how quickly people get forgotten. So that, to me, is the sad thing about it. The good thing about it is that Aberystwyth has very good storage facilities, and you know, they're willing to bring in people to research, etc. So it'll be beautifully looked up after, but it won't be seen.
No.
And that's sad, because he's a great, great photographer.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was suddenly in this weird position of having a whole career mapped out for me, and suddenly decided that what I wanted to do was something I knew nothing about, and I knew nobody involved in it at all. It's a very strange thing. I often think back and think, how on earth how did I leave the army to go and do something which I knew nothing about?
So it was an epiphanous moment for you.
It was totally. And I think it is to do with this thing, what I call to do with authorship. See, the interesting thing about photography is there's many genres of photography, and they are, in fact, very different. And you know, I'm sure we all know the thing that if there's a fire in a house, apparently the first thing that people go for is the wedding album or the family album. Now, that's a very powerful statement.
Yes.
There could be an argument that actually the best use of photography is in the family album, you know.
Yes.
But that's not what we're talking about as being great photography.
No.
That is that the content there is very emotionally powerful to people, of which they don't really need good pictures.
No.
Whatever that means, you know. I mean, one could have a discussion about what is meant by a good picture, but it's a picture which has a very strong emotional impact to the people involved in the pictures. Now, you can't dismiss that.
No.
So you can say, well, they're within that context great pictures, but they're not what a lot of us would talk about if we're talking about great pictures.
Indeed.
And the other extraordinarily important thing, if you want to get into this silly argument about what is more important, you know, you get this with people that want to call themselves artists, you know, and if you actually ask them what they mean by that term, they flounder a little bit, you know. I think what they're saying is, I want to give myself a status as important. Now, I personally think on that the only time that it's worthwhile being called an artist is if somebody you admire says to you you're an artist, not if you self-impose it on yourself as though you're a plumber. You know, who cares if you're an artist if you've been, you know, called yourself an artist, but actually you're crap. Yes. You know, it doesn't make much sense to me. But anyway, if people want to do it and they think it's going to make them a living, fine. You know, but so the second most important type of photography for anybody that's ever had a major operation. I mean, you know, I had 2 very big cancer operations where I was supposed to die. As a side thing, we hear about people saying, oh, I'm going to, you know, what I'm going to do is make my living selling prints. Well, in my case, I didn't sell a single print until 2001 when I had a cancer operation, big one, of which in one of the major magazines said, oh, David Hurn's in hospital, is likely to die. I sold 11 prints while I was lying there in the hospital bed, you know. That was the first time I ever sold a print. You know, somebody thought, God, he's going to die.
We better buy some.
We better buy a couple of prints. In fact, I actually said to the Magnum office, I said, I think once a year we should put out a rumour that, you know, so-and-so is going to die, and that'll give them enough money for the next year, you know. But the reality is that my life was partly saved by somebody taking a photograph, of which a surgeon saw the photograph. There was none of that sort of philosophical debate about whether is this photograph true or not. The surgeon presumes it's true. It's as truthful, whatever that means. You can have a discussion about that. But it's at least accurate for him to go into my body and cut it out. And that, to me, is much more important than a whole discussion about truth and God knows what, etc. You know, the radiographer that was doing this, it wouldn't have gone into his head about whether this is truthful or not. Yeah. Accuracy would be is it accurate or not, you know? But the reality is that accurate photograph that saved my life was taken by a camera up my backside. you know, now you can't get more basic than that, you know. No. So again, if you want this argument about, you know, what's more important. So I simply say everything's important as long as it's done terribly well in its particular genre.
Yes.
So I want to see the wedding photographer who does it really with care and does it well, you know. I want the medical photographer to do it so that he's clearly photographed the cancer in my body, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of those genres happens to be to do with seeing the world and trying to record that world for whatever reason, maybe for history or for sorting the world out to oneself. And the people that I think do that best, there's a lot of people that just go and do it, you know, and they do a perfectly good job, and they work for the local newspaper or this, that and the other, and they go and they photograph the beauty competition and they get the picture of the crown going on the front, and that's fine. That's what the newspaper needs. That's what the public wants. But there are other people that have what I call authorship. So, and by that I mean, if you look at the pictures of Cartier-Bresson, if you see 10 pictures are given to you by Cartier-Bresson, you know they're taken by Cartier-Bresson.
Absolutely, and that's the picture that you saw that made you cry in that magazine.
Yes, happened to be by Cartier-Bresson. Yeah. But if you put 10 pictures of Kudelka's, you would see they're by Kudelka, they're not by Cartier-Bresson, or Robert Frank, or Gary Winogrand, or Lee Friedlander. All these people have authorship.
Yes.
So when you find photographers trying to shoot pictures like other photographers, by definition, they're putting themselves in the second division.
Right.
Because you can only be in the first division if you are you.
Yes.
And you have this sort of authorship thing. I mean, it seems to me it's self-evident in a way.
Yes.
But I see so much stuff which is obviously somebody aping somebody else.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't say to them because it would be rude, but you look at it and say, well, you know, that's nothing to do with you.
Yes.
You know.
So is it about an honesty creates that authorship?
I've been very pompous now. I just think it's an innate thing. You know, you can teach somebody. If somebody comes to me and they have a degree in architecture, I can very easily teach them how to take architectural pictures because they know the front of a building from the back of a building, you know. They know what's the important features of the building, and I can say simple things like, well, point the camera at the important features, you know, etc., etc., etc. But what I can't do is teach them to be Cartier-Bresson or Kudelka.
No.
You just can't do that. Bresson and Kudelka are Bresson and Kudelka because they are totally themselves. Yes. Now, what that magical thing is, who cares? You know, the only thing that cares is that they do it.
What's the magical thing about David Hurn? What is the authorship? I can see the authorship there when I see your pictures.
It's difficult to describe. I mean, when I came back to Wales, I'd been when I first came out of the army, I went up to London. First thing I had to do was make a living, so I sold shirts in Harrods for some time. And then I would go out every evening and I would shoot pictures every evening in coffee bars and things, which is where I went. Again, it's this puzzling thing nowadays that nobody seems to shoot that they do. So I see students, and the first thing I always say to students, oh, do you have a set of pictures of the Students' Union? And they say, oh, well, that's where I go to relax. And I say, well, hang on. If you're a real photographer, you don't go anywhere to relax. You know, you're photographing. And I promised them that if they were to shoot pictures in the Students' Union, in 50 years' time, those pictures will be very valuable. Yeah. For example, if I, I have pictures from the Students' Union when I set up the course, and you suddenly discover that every single person is smoking. They don't do that anymore. That picture is a valuable picture.
Yes.
Because it historically shows what was happening at that time. So I just think that too often people are trying to think for some incredibly exotic kind of thing, whereas all around them is what is going on. And also all around them is what is disappearing. So in my own case, almost a rule of thumb is if you read anywhere that something is going to disappear, you go and photograph it.
Yes.
Because again, it's self-evident that if you photographed it and it's gone, nobody else can photograph it. Yeah. And so there's no reason why you can't get interesting pictures out of it. But on top of that, those interesting pictures are going to have a value for the next 30 or 40 years in archive, simply because it's no longer there. Yeah. And something that's no longer there, the photograph of something that's no longer there, has some form of interest to somebody, whether historically or whether, I don't know, but you can think of all sorts of reasons why it might be interesting.
Was that one of the reasons why you've put this latest book together of the 60s? Is to show those?
Oh, absolutely, because time and time again, I mean, there was a wonderful review of it in the New York Times, which basically starts off by saying, "Do we really want another book of the 60s?" Mm. And then it very kindly goes on to say, "Will we do if it's shot by David Hurn?" Because it shows actually the 60s. It's not just, the fact that I shot the Bond poster, the Bond films and Barbarella and the Beatles, etc., is actually a minor part of the book.
Yes.
And that's a minor part of the 60s. People forget that Churchill's funeral was yes. At that time. Yeah. And they, and there's a whole lot of other things, of which mundane things like the Hammersmith Palais.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
When you look at it now and you suddenly realise that thousands of people went there to sort of try and make contact with somebody of the same or opposite sex, whichever, it's a great pick-up place. And what is extraordinary is that you couldn't get in if you didn't have a suit and a tie. And yet that was taken as being the absolute norm. And yet in the pictures you suddenly find that everybody's smoking. So that change is wonderful. But that was a very 60s thing, I photographed there the last Queen Charlotte's Ball, which was this bizarre thing where debutantes, in theory, used to kneel to the Queen, to be introduced to the Queen. And then the Queen decided that this was a bit silly and she wasn't going to do it anymore. So somebody somewhere had this brilliant idea. What we'll do is, instead of the Queen, we'll have a big Christmas cake. And so all these debutantes used to come and kneel down in front of this bloody cake. Well, I mean, that is, I think, one of the more surreal things I've ever heard of. So when it was the last of these, it seemed to me a good idea to go and photograph it. Now, I've never been somebody that's wanted to take assignments. Again, it's mistaken. You sometimes feel a lot of people say, oh, well, there were colour supplements and this, that, and the other. The people that work mainly for the colour supplements, like Philip, like Patrick Ward, like Ian Berry, etc., one of the reasons that they work so much for these colour supplements is that they came up with ideas that they wanted to do. See, picture editors, they've got a tough job. They've got to produce 10 stories a week in their magazine or whatever it is. Well, obviously they can come up with all the obvious ideas. Yeah. If there's going to be a big wedding or if there's going to be the opening of Star Wars, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think that, well, we could put that in our magazine. But what they want for their main features in the magazine is somebody else's idea about something that they haven't thought of.
Yeah.
And what Philip and the people I've been talking about were very, very good at is coming up with ideas which were suitable for that magazine. Do
you, jumping back to that 60s time then, do you think that photographers had more power in those days?
No, it's exactly the same. I mean, my theory is there's a ladder with so many rungs on that ladder. And always there's basically the same number of rungs on the ladder.
Yeah.
So the trick is to be on the ladder. And if you are coming up, you've got to knock somebody off the bottom of the ladder because there's only that number of rungs.
Yes.
But I don't think the number of rungs has changed one iota.
Right. Okay.
I mean, you hear people nowadays saying, oh, well, it's much more difficult now. And then I say, well, look, go up to Paddington Station and look at the 3,000 magazines there. When I started, there wasn't any magazines in the UK. Picture Post had closed down, Illustrated had closed down. There were just newspapers,
yes.
And not only that, but it you develop film. I mean, if you look at in the book of the Grosvenor Square riot thing,
yes, indeed,
what I had to do there, I was there freelancing. I had to work out in my mind, how do I photograph the start, which was in Trafalgar Square? How do I make sure that I can follow the march? How do I make sure I can photograph the principal people on the march? And how do I get to the American embassy early enough to be behind the police lines, not cut out? Now that's a logistics problem,
and that's the strategies you learn.
And that's the strategies that you begin to learn if you were doing those sort of things.
Yeah.
And it was to do with getting a bicycle or going somewhere and getting a friend to pick up the bicycle as you dropped it and went somewhere else. It's a very complicated thing to do, but having got there and being one of the few people that were inside the ring, then obviously you've got to be able to photograph and get it in focus and all that sort of thing, and maybe have a kind of personal geometry which works within the thing. But having done those pictures, I then had to get back home. I had to, let's say I shot 10 rolls of film on it. I then had to develop those 10 rolls of film. I had to dry those 10 rolls of film. I then had to make 15 sets of 15 pictures, which meant printing all night long. I then had to put those sets of pictures into envelopes. I then had to go down to the post office when it opened and to post these pictures. Now, tell me what's the easiest, doing that or going back home and pressing a button on a computer, having downloaded your card, I mean, it's obviously easier now than it was then.
Yes.
But the reality is that, I get people say, oh, yes, but when you were there, there was Life magazine and Look magazine, and I have to sound very pompous and to turn around and say, well, yeah, there were, but you wouldn't have been in those magazines. Those magazines use the 20 or 30 best photographers in the world.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
And if you are one of the 20 or 30 best photographers in the world now, you will discover that in Italy, in Brazil, in Spain, there are still magazines of that quality.
Yes.
You would be in those magazines now. And the answer is you're not going to be, because they're being filled up by, the people we think are the great photographers.
Yes.
So get that out of your head and just get into being like somebody else. Work your butt off. And if you are better, whatever that means, but it's usually it's about linking to what the purpose of your pictures is. If you are better than other people, you will survive. And if you're not, you will do a different type of photography.
Yes.
Which is perfectly honourable to do. I mean, for heaven's sake, it's, being a photographer is primarily a job.
Yes.
If you say this is what I want to do, then you've got to survive and not die of malnutrition, So let's call it what it is. It's a job.
Yes.
It's a very enjoyable job. I can't think of anything I would have loved to do more. And it gives you enormous opportunities, because the beauty about photography is you have to be there to do it.
Yes.
You can't do it over a phone or anything like that. So if you get to a certain standard, you get to the point where you can go anywhere you like in the world, and by and large can meet anybody you want to in the world. Now, that is obviously enjoyable. It's great fun. Even if when you meet somebody, you find them to be a son of a bitch. That's interesting. And then you meet other people and you suddenly realise how brilliant they really are, and that, Bertrand Russell, you suddenly realise if you spend some time, photographing him, you realise why he was considered one of the great philosophers. He is absolutely self-evident, brilliant.
Yes.
And that's wonderful, and that's uplifting.
When you were photographing and doing portraits, what sort of kind of rapport did you have with the sitter? I mean, how important was that to you?
It was not that important to me,
right.
In that I was always very well researched. It seemed to me silly and rude not to know. You don't go up to somebody and say, "Oh, I've got to shoot your picture. What do you do?" Which is so. I would want to know a lot about the person. So if I had a conversation with them, I at least looked as though I knew what they had written or what they had painted or what they had composed or something, and could make comments about it. It seems to me that, and nowadays, of course, that's terribly easy to do. You go onto Google and press a button, and the whole damn thing is written down for you. Whereas at the time you had to go into the British Library and go in and sit down and actually do a little bit of research.
Yeah.
But having done that, I always preferred to photograph with a writer with me.
Oh, right, okay.
And because I don't like setting up things very much.
Okay.
And if I had a writer with me, as long as I had the right sort of writer who could bring out some kind of animation in the person, I could then be an observer. So I might suddenly say halfway through, do you mind if we move to somewhere else? But I would rely on somebody, making them laugh or making them do or being interested. And then I would interject certain questions which I thought might be slightly oblique questions.
Yes.
Because that would get a look of interest. Yes. And that's what I would do. And that's the way I always preferred to work. I find it very difficult to talk to somebody and shoot pictures at the same time. I can't I find it difficult to do that. And when it came to doing the book Living in Wales, that was based really on a very simple thing, and that was I loved the portraits of August Sander. And I could never quite puzzle out why I liked the pictures so much, because they're very ordinary. I don't know if you know the pictures of Sander, but they're pretty ordinary. And I realised that one of the reasons I liked them was that they gave the people dignity. In other words, the photographer August Sander was not the least bit interested in August Sander. He was interested in his subject matter. And so it seemed to me that the subject matter always looked dignified. So what I decided to do was to shoot all the pictures on a tripod. I used a Rolleiflex, of which I had specially made, because I when I was looking through the Rolleiflex, I could never see the viewfinder. So I got a beautiful separate viewfinder off a Hasselblad, and had it adapted to go on the top of a Rolleiflex, so that I could see then in it. What I did was to always go. I did a lot of research on a person, and then I would go beforehand and find the background first, so I would know where I wanted the person, and then I would set up my camera, and what I did was I just had a simple ploy. I used to say to the people, I said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but this is a very long exposure, half a second exposure. Do you mind just getting into a position where you feel comfortable and you can hold it? And I would just keep shooting the same picture until they became so bored that they began to forget that it was a picture. And then somehow I then sensed there might be something. And I think the book works for me because I think it does have a look again. It has that look. And the look is that they're all standing there for half a second. Now, obviously, they're not. I was shooting at a 500th or something. But they thought that they had to be... So they would get into a position where... And then I would say, look, pretend you're back in the Victorian era. I want you to get that look of which you feel dignified. And all the time I kept using this word dignified. I want you to look dignified. And so that was my simple ploy, you know. So I have the ploy beforehand, and then I simply do it, you know. But what I can't do is to talk to somebody and shoot a picture of them. It's always nonsense for me. It doesn't work. You know, but we all have our ways of doing it.
It's unlocking that.
Unlocking what is you know, and then with a bit, if you're lucky, what you produce is something which has a kind of authorship to it. It either does or it doesn't. You know, obviously most commercial photographers don't. They all look like each other in a strange sort of way, which is fine because it's usually what the person being photographed wants. I found it advantageous to have a writer with me or somebody.
And you went out to Hungary with a writer, of course. You went out with John.
With John Anthony. John was at Sandhurst with me, and it was funny, we were best friends then, and I had no idea that he was going to leave, and he had no idea I was going to leave. But he came up to London, he wanted to be a writer. And he was a very funny guy, and he ended up writing with Spike Milligan. And that led to all sorts of other things, because I'd been photographing in the coffee bars, etc. And suddenly what I discovered was early on was that kind of networking thing. I mean, I put people into two categories. There are what I call doers and there are talkers.
Yeah.
And what I discovered was that if you were a doer, you attract other doers. And if you were a talker, you attract other talkers. When I was going round the coffee bars, I met people like Ken Russell, Colin Wilson, Walter Lassley, Michael Foot, later politician, at that time working, I think, for the New Statesman, young people like Julie Christie, who was still at school, I think. But you found that you gravitated together because you were obviously, when you were talking, you were somebody that was going to not just chat about it, but actually go and do it. Yeah. And those people like each other because there's nothing better than being with somebody who has ambitions to be the best at what they do. And there's nothing more draining than being with people that are continually talking about the book they're going to read or they're going to write or the picture story they're going to do. And you suddenly realise that their idea of doing a picture story is, 2 weekends or whatever it is. I mean, it's very strange how... I mean, I saw some work the other day of somebody who sat down, and before they showed me the pictures, I said, "Well, tell me what it is that you were photographing," and they said, "Oh, well, I read in I forget the country. It was an African country, but they had a terrific problem with AIDS there, and it was due to the religious beliefs, and the head of the country didn't believe there was such a thing as AIDS, and it was et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And so I went there to do an in-depth study of this thing. I said, "Well, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting story. It's, I would have thought, visually quite difficult to do. Anyway, let's look at your pictures." And they then showed me was 10 portraits of people, women, standing in front of a door, different doors. And I said, "But hang on, I could have shot that in my back garden in an afternoon. Why did you go all the way there to shoot this?" And they said, "Oh, well, all these people have AIDS." So I said, "But that has nothing to do with the story you were talking about. These are set-up portraits that you could do in your back garden." Yeah. That is not how you become a great photographer.
Yeah.
You have to understand what it is you're trying to do. Yeah. And then when you get there, you have to try to, in your own way, in your own personal authorship, the word keeps coming up, way, so that if Bresson had been shooting that story and Kudelka had been shooting that story and Robert Frank had shot that story, they would have shot 3 separate stories, but they would have been complete.
Yes.
The thing about Frank is that he started off again being a magazine photographer. All these people worked in that way, and they know how to put together a story so that it works as a story. That's not to say that they don't have great individual pictures within that story. But there's a linear, but there's a narrative to it. Yeah, or not necessarily beginning to end. No. But there is some kind of thing of which you sense that the grouping of pictures has a different ambiance to a single picture. So what is the power of that then, David? I mean, you can look back at Bresson's work, you look at your work. Yeah. There's a power to it. I can't. It's an indescribable thing, and can it move mountains? Can it change people's perceptions? It does to me. Yeah. I mean, I started off by crying by looking at a picture. Well, I knew nothing about pictures, I have a picture on my wall. If you go up to the toilet, you will see a picture by Philip Jones Griffiths in Vietnam of a civilian who's totally covered in bandages at a link. I've had people go up there and come into this room afterwards with tears in their eyes looking at that picture. Now, I don't... people can philosophize about, you can't do this, pictures don't mean that. Photographers are not making a definitive statement about something. Somehow or another, the best photographers are producing something which can create emotion in people. And I challenge anybody to look at that picture by Philip and not be emotionally moved. I couldn't care a bugger about somebody else analysing it, etc. If they want to analyse it and that's their game. If they like to talk to each other and sit analysing, fine, why not? But I don't think it has anything to do with what I think about photography. I think photography has, when it's wonderful, it has the ability to just look staggeringly beautiful.
Yes.
It has the ability to make you cry. It has the ability to make you laugh. Now, I think all these are very good things.
Yes.
They're what I call being a human being.
Yes.
Yes.
And
so it can do that. And the extraordinary thing about a photograph is that, in theory, all it is it's a trace. Light going through a hole at the front of a box, basically. And it's always been the same. The method that trace is recorded changes from being, a albumen print or whatever it is to a wood retype or it's a silver print or whatever. But actually the trace is still the same. In theory, all you should see in a photograph is the trace, and the great majority of people in the world can see that. So that if I were to shoot a picture of you now, I suspect that 99.9% of people would realise you've got glasses on. That's information that the trace get. But there are some pictures which not only give you that information of which most people think, but has another dimension, which is indescribable in a way. It just is that it produces this emotional thing in a way that you wouldn't think photography could do it. Now, I don't want to analyse that, because if I could analyse it, it would take the fun out of it for me. I just accept it.
Yes.
I accept that Philip's picture and moves me deeply. And every time I go up the stairs to the loo, it moves me. Every single time. It doesn't diminish, it doesn't go away, it's there. It's somewhere, it's inherent in that picture. That's magical. Yeah,
that is magical. But do you think that magic is being devalued today because we're bombarded by images on a daily basis? Do you believe that?
Because I think we're bombarded by, a lot of the time, they're images of people trying to put themselves in the world as some important thing. They're all self-images. And why not? If that makes the person that's doing it happy, but it doesn't threaten me.
No.
So when I hear people say, there's all these millions of images in the world, I say, fine, if people are happy doing it, lovely. And within its genre, and within the genre of friends, showing it to other friends, it's lovely. But it's not. It's nothing to do with what I do, and it doesn't threaten me in the least.
No.
So I don't understand. Again, there's discussions about these things are usually by people that are out of work, that can't get published.
Yeah.
It's all this terminology. They invent words like, I'm a street photographer. And I say, what you mean is you're out of work. And they said, so I said, Bresson was a street photographer. Every time you go outside and photograph on the street, presumably you're a street photographer. It's just that he did it better than you do.
Yes, indeed.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So why not, why invent this thing to give yourself some kind of status which actually you don't merit? What would be better is that you went and shot lots and lots and lots of pictures and tried to understand why some of these people that are considered the great photographers are great photographers. Maybe that would improve you. You know, look at Bresson's pictures. Look at whoever you like. You know, look at Gary Winogrand or Lee Friedland or whoever. Weegee, in my particular case, Sergio Loren. Yes. Weegee and Sergio Loren, to me, are the two great photographers, greatest photographers. But look at them. Don't try to copy them.
No.
But try to analyse why you think their pictures are so wonderful. And usually in the end, you will say it's because of authorship.
Yeah.
They look like their pictures.
Yeah.
So the next struggle for the photographer is to see if you have this ability to go and just be yourself.
Yeah.
Now, the answer is the history of painting, the history of music, the history says that very few people can do that. You know, Beethoven did not write music like Bach.
No.
You know, that's the reality of it.
Yeah.
And there are very few people who can do that. But there are lots of people that can write pop songs.
Yeah.
So that's fine. It's perfectly okay. But just accept that that's what you're doing.
Yes.
And so if you become the wedding photographer, don't feel that that's some lesser thing. Going back to what I said at the beginning, there's an argument for say that it's the most important type of photography. So embrace that. Just try to do it well.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, doing things well is
it's
crucial, really.
It's the only criteria.
Yes.
You know, it's just that there is this strange genre of which, you know, the Sergio Lorenz and people like that fit into.
Yes.
But it's one of the genres.
What did you learn from talking to other photographers? What is there anything that stands out in your head that actually made you think, yes, that's the key for me. That's what will give me authorship of what I'm doing. Was there anything?
Well, never to do with authorship, because I just don't. I think that has to come out of the person. But I suppose one of the things is that, you know, the Barenboim thing of saying, how do you become a great pianist? You play the piano.
Right, okay. Yes.
What I found characteristic about all the people I liked is that they work their butts off.
Right, okay.
They really seriously take a lot of pictures. They're not what I call weekend photographers, just occasionally. They shoot pictures every day, all the time. Yeah. And the other thing various things. One is that they finish. You know, an enormous amount of people are always saying, well, I'm working on a project on, and I say, well, I'm not interested in that. Let's have a look at one you finished, you know.
Yes.
It's very difficult to finish things. And then the other thing is the extraordinary attention to detail.
Yeah.
The fact that they want to get it right. So they will go to enormous ends to get it right. Whereas lesser photographers usually take the easiest solution.
And make do.
You know. So I think if you get those three things, they are characteristics of people that write music, that write books. I mean, I remember doing a story on Graham Greene once, and I actually stayed with him in the south of France. And I was amazed because he used to get up very early in the morning, you know, 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and he used to write and for about an hour, and then he'd have coffee, and then he'd write. And then at midday, he would put all the stuff in the wastepaper basket. And I'd say, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm not writing, because I'm not writing a novel, I'm practicing. And I thought, hang on, there's this great writer that's actually saying that unless he writes every day, he's out of the thing. I thought that was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And most of the people, you know, I knew Lucian Freud pretty well, and as a painter, etc. And they're the same. I mean, you could never go round to his studio that he wasn't painting. You know, he painted all the time. He wasn't sort of somewhere with a few friends talking about bloody painting. He was painting.
Yeah.
And I think that all, you know, you put all those things together and even if you just did those things, you would be better. In a year's time, you would be better than you are now. Now, whether you were lucky to have this extra, whatever this extra is, you know, that's out of the gods, except I don't believe in the gods, but it would be out of something, you know. But at least if you did these other things, you would be better than you are at the moment, you know.
To jump back to the 60s, and I mean, you had what you call, I think, in on being a photographer, the Doss House.
Yes.
But it was a great fulcrum of activity then.
It was extraordinary. But I mean, the reason it was extraordinary is that the kind of photography that I have always loved is the lowest paid of all photography. I worked out once that if I'd been an estate agent photographer, I would have earned much more money than I would earn out of working for magazines. It's still the same. Yeah. And so what happens is that when you are a reportage photographer, let's call it that, particularly if you're working purely on your own ideas and then trying to sell them afterwards, which is what most of the very best people have done, you don't have that much money. So you're always trying to stay with friends wherever you go. And it happened that I had a rent-controlled, very large flat in Bayswater. And so everybody used to come and stay there. So, I mean, it was not unusual to have 6 or 7 people all staying there. In fact, we actually had mattresses on one floor, and you look down the list, and it's a who's who of extraordinary people that.
So there was a great exchange of ideas then, and a great.
I mean, there was nothing better. We used to once a week always go round to the Bistingo. It's funny, I can remember the name of the place, and we had a table there which was never less than 12 people, and we ate together around that table. And I can remember being there with Richard Avedon was there, Mark Reboot was there. He'd just come back from the Pope's visit to somewhere. And Lester Bookbinder, who was a wonderful advertising photographer, and almost certainly, all these people, and some students, bright students would know we were there, and they would come and sit down. And you sat down and discussed photography. It wasn't some hierarchical thing about, you certainly wasn't talking about photography as being an art, because, again, people don't realise there were no photo galleries until 1970.
No.
And so the idea of calling yourself an artist would have been nonsense, because there's nowhere to put your art. So, I mean, somebody like Bill Brandt, who was later, because people could make money out of it, but galleries realised they could make money out of it, elected him as being an artist. I mean, he never talked about being an artist. He worked for Pitch Post or for Holiday Magazine in America or Lilliput, or, he was a magazine photographer, and accepted that as being what he did. So the conversations there were, in my opinion, much more productive and much more democratic, in that everybody just discussed what they were doing. Whereas now I quickly get really irritated by, as I say, this desperate thing of everybody trying to give themselves self-status in a way, which doesn't stand up to much scrutiny most of the time.
Yes.
The only person that can tell you if you've done it very well is somebody else.
Yes.
And not your friend.
Yes.
Your friend is obviously, that's the problem I have with the Welshness, is that there's a kind of feeling in Wales that if you happen to be Welsh, that means you must have done it well. Well, the answer is, it couldn't get a crap. The person that's going to tell you if you've done it well is somebody that lives in New York.
Yes.
If they don't know you and look at your work and say, I think that's wonderful, that means something.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't mean something if the Western Mail says you've done it well, because they're in the business of saying all Welsh people are wonderful. Which is nice, and it's fine, and it's friendly, but it doesn't stack up in terms of the rest of the world looking at Wales, It just doesn't do that. And the only way you can do that is to get out into that outside world and compete.
So, then let's jump back.
Yeah.
Who were you, when you started your photographic career, who did you go to and say, look at these?
Okay. I was very lucky because when I started, it was at the period when also starting was McCullen, Philip, Ian, Patrick Ward, John Bulmer. There was a wonderful group of young photographers. People forget, we were all working. I was 21 when I went to Hungary.
Yeah.
You know, and these other photographers are roughly the same age as I were, and we were all out there competing. And we would try to get an assignment from newspapers. There weren't really any magazines in this country. And very often the newspapers at that time would pay your expenses and only pay you if it was published. And so I can tell you, you don't half learn quickly if you're photographing, let's say, at a political rally or something, and you suddenly see that McCullen's next to you, and you say, "Oh, hi, Don. Nice to see you here. Who are you? Are you got an assignment? Are you doing it for somebody?" And they say, "Oh, yes, I'm doing it for the Observer." And you suddenly realise you're doing it for the Observer. And what he's actually saying is that one of the two of you might get paid if it's published. Boy, oh boy, does that make you get the picture in focus.
Yes.
You learn pretty damn quick in those circumstances. So that whole learning thing of needing to, again, these terms that people would argue about, but doing it better than the next guy is very important.
Right.
And doing it better than the next guy, obviously, sometimes had, it's very subtly different. Very subtly different. It was to do with understanding the needs of who you're working for.
Okay.
I mean, you can give a very simple example. If I went up to some young lady at that time in the street and said, I work for Playboy magazine, I'd like to shoot some pictures of you, she would know what I meant by that. What we all know is it wouldn't be published in the Catholic Herald. No. Now, that's editorial policy. Yeah. Now it's pretty easy to understand one, but actually all magazines, newspapers, think that what they do is really good.
Yeah.
So if you're going to try to publish in some way or get paid by somebody, you better know what their editorial policy is, and then you can subtly, it doesn't mean to say that you don't take your pictures, but you can guide your pictures a little bit this way or that way towards the editorial policy. Now that little tiny bit of moving is what gets you published or not. Yeah. And all the way through, I mean, nowadays, I do pretty well out of selling prints and things. But I print my own, but I print better than anybody. And I print better than anybody because I've been willing to get hold of a machine and realise that if I buy software to run that machine that costs me more than the machine, I mean, I have a printer of which the software that's running it is not the software they gave me, but it's different software, RIP software, and that software costs more than the machine, it means that I get 5% more out of that machine. And if I then learn how to adjust that thing, if I learn how to make sure the temperature in the room is the same all the time, then I get another 4 or 5%. And so what I've got in the end is 10% more than somebody who just has the same machine and puts the paper in and presses the button. Now, if you're just seeing the print, you don't see the difference. But if you see the print next to another print, you see the difference. And if you've got 5 people, in the Magnum office on a big table, a collector comes in and he likes 5 pictures and he's looking at them and he can't make up his mind which content he likes best, he's going to pick the print which is the best print. So you better be that person. And that attention to detail in every single facet is what is important all the time. You've got to be that. It's got to be. It's just as part of. It's sort of osmosis or something. It's just part of yourself. You don't think about it.
No, but it's something that you've learnt anyway, isn't it?
You've learnt by experience of shooting and shooting and shooting and seeing hundreds of pictures and realising that when you speak to collectors that they are affected by these things. And all this sort of stuff goes into your head. But you don't learn it out of a book, because nobody... The problem is that most of the people who write books never do this sort of stuff. They're usually a different type of photographer, and they don't understand these things. It's the same with most colleges. You go to the college, and by and large, most of the people that teach you just don't know this stuff. They really don't know this stuff, and yet, in my estimation, it's the only stuff that's teachable. They're all busy trying to, let everybody be Martin Parr or Kudelka or whoever you like.
Yeah.
That's not teachable.
No.
That really isn't teachable. So they're trying to teach that a lot of the time that isn't teachable, whereas that is teachable, I mean, the simple thing that I always keep, and amazingly remains in the minds of people that are still photographing, after they've been on the course, they used to say to me, what's the most important thing I should get? Should I get this camera or that camera? I said, the camera doesn't carry a bugger. Good shoes.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you get. Because if you're going to be a photographer and walk for 12 hours a day, you better have good feet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I have never, ever, now here they do, because it becomes, it's been picked up by things. But you don't get people teaching saying that. And the reason they don't say that is because they never walk for 12 hours a day, every day, photographing. Going back to the thing of the DOS house, when Joseph came out from Czechoslovakia, Elliot Erwitt brought him to see me, and Elliot said, look, this is Kudelka, etc., Czech photographer, very good Czech photographer. Of course, we hadn't heard of him. And he's got some film that needs processing. Can he stay with you? And I said, yes, of course, he can. So I say to Joseph, who could hardly speak English at that time, how many rolls of film do you have? Thinking, when you think a film tank takes 4 rolls of film, and etc. And he said 800 rolls. I realised he was there for a pretty good stay, And anyway, he stayed for... We've never quite worked out whether it was 8 years or 11 years, or So he lived in various flats, and he came down here when I lived here, and we're so close that we actually introduce each other now as brothers. So this is my brother, I say, and he always gives me his books, and it's always in the front saying, to my dear brother, so and so and so and so. But so we're very, very close, and which is lovely for me, because I really do think that he is one of the all-time great photographers, and therefore it's wonderful to know him, because he's so perceptive, and he's very honest. So if he says he quite likes something you've done. It's a pretty good person to say it's, he likes it. And if he says, oh, that's wrong, because he's very blunt, but if he says that's wrong, you think about it, because he's not saying that because he wants to be one-upmanship.
No, it's because it's wrong.
He's saying because it's wrong. It's as simple as that. And they're the most difficult people to find. The most difficult people to find are people with real knowledge who you trust in what they say. And from those people, you can be uplifted and you can learn a lot, So I only have to, when my dear friend Bill Jay, who's died, who I did the book with, he was extraordinary, because when he gave a lecture about anything, you came out feeling that you ought to go and shoot pictures. He inspired you to want to do things. Yeah. And those are the people I like. I like. I remember I was friendly with Daniel Barenboim, the pianist, quite early on, and I remember going to a concert that he had played at the Welbeck Hall, was it? Anyway, it's in London. And we were going to eat afterwards, and I said to him, I said, I really don't understand this, Daniel. I cannot believe that any human being can get in front of this instrument and play like that. It seems almost inhuman to be able to do it. It's that extraordinary. Yeah. And yet it couldn't be done by a machine. No. So it is a human thing, but it's outside what one's mind can cope with.
Yes.
And I said, but what is the essence of being a concert pianist? He said, oh, you play the piano a lot. And I thought that was unbelievable advice.
Yes.
You know, because it pertains to everything. So it's very often what I'm saying about photography.
And you watch him conduct as well.
I was very friendly with his wife at that time, Jacqueline Dupre.
Yeah.
And sadly, I went through the whole process and photographed, but we didn't know that she had MS. And one first knew it by, she was, during practice, used to wear gloves and things because her hands got cold. And it was very sad in the end. But that experience with that sort of person is so uplifting because, you know, this is a guy that used to sit down and sort of practice. If you went on a train with him, as I wanted, he had a quiet keyboard. He would play in the carriage, you know, and he would play nothing, no sound would come out, but he obviously could hear it in a way, in his mind. Yeah. And you realise this great pianist, how much he practiced, you know. And I remember thinking to myself, well, is photography such a lesser thing that you don't have to do this? So perhaps you do have to do it. Perhaps you do have to put in that amount of work. And perhaps that's why, or part of why, Kudelka's Kudelka and Bresson is Bresson and Gary Winogrand is Gary Winogrand. Perhaps because they have this attention to detail and put it in, and they don't talk about it all the time. No. So many photographers, I think, do far more talking than shooting pictures, you know. Well, for me, you know, you take pictures with your head and with your heart and with your eyes, not with your ears. No. You know.
It's the Ken Russell thing. And I watched the documentary he made, and which kind of led.
Which one? There's two. The House in Bayswater.
Yeah, the House in Bayswater.
Oh, okay.
Which I found phenomenal.
Yeah.
I was a
Watch
great.
the Birdie is a better one.
Watch
you get to see it. Yeah.
Because I was a great admirer of his work when I was growing up, and I remember seeing the Delius, which had a profound effect on me as an extraordinary piece of work. But he was a photographer as well, wasn't he?
He was a ballet dancer originally. Yeah. He went from being a ballet dancer. I actually knew him at the time in the coffee bars when he was a ballet dancer, and then he started to shoot pictures. Yeah, and he did really bizarre things then as a photographer, and then he got hold of a little Bolex camera. It was a wind-up Bolex, I remember, and the first contact I had with him in that was he made a little movie called Amelia and the Angels.
I've seen it.
And it's absolutely charming.
It is.
Absolutely charming. And he showed that to Hugh Weldon, who was at that time head of Monitor, which was a wonderful BBC arts programme.
Yes.
And Hugh Weldon, being very bright, realised that this was a really extraordinary person. And so he brought him in to make things for the BBC. And he shot a lot of films for the BBC. Yeah. I mean, 30 or 40 or 50 or something like that. And so all his friends tended to be in all those things. I mean, I think I'm in about a dozen of them, you know, dressed up as something or other. And Ken had a great ability to sort of make you go and wallow in the mud in some place, pretending you were in the Somme or something, you know. But he was an extraordinary person, I think. You know, he got a bit carried away in some of his big films. I think he was at his best when he actually had somebody restraining him a little bit. Yeah. So he had Hugh Weldon, and then Humphrey Burton was also at Monitor. And they were a little bit restraining on him when he went out into that big wide world of the bigger films. I mean, in my opinion, on every film he made, there are great moments in the film, great visual moments, great things. But sometimes his successes made the overall film not be as great a film as it might have been. Yeah. But I mean, he's still, in my opinion, one of the great British filmmakers. I mean, boy, he had a kind of authorship thing about it, even if it was just because it was so extreme.
Yeah, yes.
But he was a major person and a dear friend. I liked him enormously, and
Aberfan.
Yeah.
And can I say, there's one picture in your latest book, and it's the picture of the two boys overlooking the scene, and I think that is
the iconic picture of the thing.
Picture of the thing. It's not actually the digging and all that stuff that was going on.
Yeah.
How did that affect you? And
I was in Bristol and with Ian Berry, in fact, and I have no idea why we were there. And suddenly on the news, I heard about it, and obviously being Welsh and etc., it suddenly hit me, and I said, look, I've got to go there, and he said, oh yeah, well he'd come, etc. So we got to Aberfan during the daylight at that time. Now it was, we're talking about crap killing kids.
Yes.
Not only crap killing kids, but crap that shouldn't be there, and was only there for financial reasons. So the whole thing was obscene. What you were confronted with was a lot of miners digging their kids out of slurry which was undiggable. As fast as they dug, it was filling in. So the whole thing was horrendous. It is obvious that they, as the miners, didn't want you there. The natural reaction of somebody in that circumstance is that, I don't want them watching me looking for my dead child. Very reasonable. On the other hand, if you thought like I did, you realised that this was a historic thing of which you needed to record so that in the future it didn't happen again. Now it happened that I think because of some of the pictures, of which a lot of them were mine, they did actually change the whole thing, and from then on they got rid of the whole sort of thing. So you had there was this extraordinary tension of having to be incredibly sensitive, because quite rightly the people digging had the right of saying, I don't want you there, but knowing that they were wrong. They were wrong in those sorts. That was an emotional response they had, which was not based on the experience of knowing what happened in the future. So it was very tricky to do, and obviously it was very emotional to do in every way, but one still had to do it, and one still had to do it not getting overpowered by emotion, but doing it as a story. You needed certain pictures. You needed that overall picture. That's why I did this insane thing, which I still don't understand how I did, of going up to the top of the where the slip was.
Yes.
It's only when I look now to think, hang on, that's what gave way.
Yes, there's that stark image with that piece of whatever sticking out, and you're looking down and
I'm looking down on it. Yeah. And I thought, how on earth did I do this bizarre thing of going up there? It's insane to have done it. Yeah. But it was to do with the fact that knowing that was potentially a key picture in the thing.
Yeah.
And then you begin to look for pictures which somehow fit together to give an overall feel as much as anything of what the thing was. And so, I'm usually quite good at finding these sort of things like the kids together. And it's just the way I think, It was why when I was in Paris, even though I was walking, it was right up my street, because what I was interested in, I wasn't interested in police rushing around and doing that. I couldn't keep up with that. But I was interested in people hugging each other with remorse, and people with flowers giving flowers to each other and all that sort of thing. Yeah. And so it's the same in the thing like Aberfan, was that I was much more interested in that kind of human reaction which I did, and that particular picture was the picture that was Parry Match did it as a full spread across Japan, and I think Stern did the same, and so it was seen all over the world, and though I say it, there's no doubt that that set of pictures had a big effect in countries outside of Wales of suddenly realising what had happened, and in some way trying to contribute to help in the thing. So it was, and it was, that story made me feel I wanted to come back to Wales. It was, 66 was it? I think it was.
Yes.
I actually then came back to Wales in 1970, so it took me about a 4-year period. But I was there and I suddenly felt very Welsh. And I thought, I think I would actually prefer to live here than in London, Every time I came back to Wales, I used to remember, fresh air smells funny. It was nice to get to Wales and suddenly have this funny smelling air. It was called pure air, as opposed to drinking in the garbage of London. Yeah. So it was very important for me. It was also important to me in the Magnum thing because I hadn't, although, as I said, I was sliding into Magnum. Actually, Bresson saw the pictures and wrote a very nice letter, an open letter to Magnum to say this is absolutely Magnum at its best or something. And at that point, I realised, well, hang on, I might as well formally apply, to be honest, knowing that there was no way if Bresson wrote a letter about what you did, that the other photographers were going to say no.
Yeah.
So it was very important to me in many ways. It undoubtedly helped in the getting into Magnum, and it rekindled my realisation that at the back of my mind, home was Cardiff, basically, and so it was important to me. And I guess it still is. I think it's the thing that is most ingrained in my mind of doing, and it is obscene. It was obscene.